The first night I heard the voices rising from the sea. I thought the radio was malfunctioning. The sound wasn't static though. It was layered, like distant singing, echoing from hundreds of feet below the rig. I should have ignored it, but curiosity pulled me toward the edge of the deck. That was when the shift supervisor grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and hissed a reminder. I'll never forget. There are 11 rules out here. Rules you follow if you want to live. I remember the first time I broke one of them, and the ocean showed me something I was never meant to see. I'll tell you everything, but only if you're ready to know why we're forbidden to go alone when the sirens begin. I remembered my first week on the rig, when the supervisors drilled Rule 1, never leave the rig without permission into us. Like it was sacred law, warning of consequences that weren't just administrative. The ocean stretched endlessly around us, black and unbroken, and the wind cut through my jacket as though trying to push me overboard. I could hear the faint hum of the engines vibrating through the metal deck, and every step I took felt amplified in the night. Some of the crew laughed off the warnings, but their uneasy glances toward the water betrayed a deeper fear. Even in the light of day, the rig felt alive, as though it could sense who dared stray too close to the edge. By the third night, I understood why the old-timers were so serious. One of them told a story about a man who'd wandered to the outer deck during a calm night shift, ignoring orders. He had only been gone a few minutes, but when they found his helmet floating, the water below was perfectly still, not a ripple to mark his descent. They never found his body. I could see the dread in the veteran's eyes as he recalled it, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. Even the youngest recruits suddenly seemed more cautious, hugging the center of the platform, avoiding the edges as if the sea itself could reach out for anyone who strayed. A few nights later, curiosity got the better of me. I lingered on the deck near the railing after my shift, staring down into the abyss. The water was a mirror of darkness, reflecting nothing, yet I sensed movement beneath. My thoughts raced as I wondered if the sea was alive, if it could feel me watching. The shadows shifted in a way that didn't match the current, and I caught a glimpse of something dark and elongated beneath the surface. I recoiled instinctively, my fingers gripping the steel so tightly they ached. The hum of the engines faded as I strained to hear over the wind, and my heartbeat became deafening in the eerie silence. The new engineer, a skeptic, noticed my hesitation. "You're imagining things," he said, stepping closer to the edge, peering down at the water. "There's nothing there. It's just shadows and reflections." I wanted to protest, to insist he step back, but the look in his eyes told me he would dismiss any warning. I swallowed hard, feeling that same dread the old-timers had described. His movements toward the outer deck made my stomach knot, and I realized then that this place tested not only your skills, but your judgment, your very instincts. The ocean seemed to pulse beneath us, anticipating a wrong step. One afternoon, a minor mechanical problem forced us to inspect a platform far from the central deck. I followed the skeptic and two others down narrow walkways, steel shaking slightly under our weight, water churning below. The sea was deceptively calm, but I felt the tension rising in my chest, as though the rig itself was warning me. Every creak of the metal underfoot sounded like it could betray our position to whatever lurked beneath. The skeptic joked and laughed, but the humor faltered when a sudden shadow passed across the floodlights, a shape too massive for a school of fish. Everyone froze. Even the seasoned crew exchanged worried glances. By nightfall, the rig felt like a different place. The hum of machinery became a chorus of whispers, echoing along corridors and up the stairwells. I stayed close to the center, moving only when necessary, but my mind kept wandering to the edges, to the vast darkness surrounding us. One of the newer crew members ventured too far to check a valve and returned shaking, claiming he'd seen something rising just beneath the surface. Nobody laughed, nobody argued. We just nodded and continued, silently acknowledging that the ocean had a mind of its own. During the following storm, the danger became tangible. The waves hammered the rig, tossing steel crates and loose equipment, and rain battered our faces. Visibility dropped to nothing, and we relied entirely on the floodlights and each other. I stayed near the core of the platform, watching the ocean rage around us, feeling a pulse of fear that wasn't entirely caused by the storm. Every slip, every stumble, every shadow made me question whether the rig itself was protecting us, or watching to see who would falter. That night, I understood the true cost of carelessness. The sea was patient, but it never forgot. The skeptic finally spoke up, voice trembling despite his attempts to remain casual. "Maybe it's all in our heads," he said, as lightning illuminated the deck for a brief second. But I could see the fear creeping into his movements, the way he kept his back toward the water, the subtle hesitation in every step. The rig had become more than a workplace. It was a trap and a lifeline at once, a barrier between us and the cold depths below. The others avoided the edges instinctively, and I realized I had done the same long before the storm began. When the storm passed, the damage revealed the truth of how fragile our survival was. A maintenance hatch had been torn loose, dangling perilously over the dark water, and the scent of salt and machinery filled the air. I shivered, thinking of how easy it would have been for someone to wander too close, for curiosity to cost them everything. The skeptic avoided the hatch entirely, murmuring under his breath that we should have stayed in the central quarters. I nodded silently, aware that we had all learned, perhaps too late, that some rules were beyond human judgment. Even in the following weeks, I never ventured far from the rig's core alone. The ocean stretched endlessly, dark and unknowable, a reminder of what could happen in an instant. Every shadow, every shifting reflection beneath the steel beams reminded me of the man who had vanished the first week. The stories became part of our routine, whispered warnings during shift changes and late-night checks. I learned to watch, to listen, to sense when the water itself seemed to move against us. The rig was our sanctuary, but it was also a cage, one that kept the sea's appetite at bay. By the end of the month, I had internalized a silent, desperate respect for the boundaries that had been set. The new engineer, now quiet and cautious, no longer challenged the invisible walls of the platform. Even small lapses in attention or brief moments of curiosity could lead to consequences no one could reverse. I spent nights awake on the central deck, feeling the wind and the distant hum of the machinery, knowing that every step toward the edge was a gamble I could never afford. The ocean was patient, but it was always watching, waiting for someone to forget, and as I stood there one final night, the lights reflecting faintly on the endless black, I realized the rig itself had become part of me. It had taught me caution, fear, and respect for the vast unknown beneath us. The ocean could wait, and it always would, but for the unwary it could strike without warning, silently, without mercy. That night, I knew that my survival depended on every choice I made, every movement, every breath, and that lesson would follow me through the rest of the 11 rules. The first time I truly understood Rule 2. Never go alone when the sirens start singing. It was the second week of my deployment, and the night had fallen so fast, it felt like the rig had been swallowed by darkness. I was patrolling the perimeter of the deck, double-checking lights and pressure gauges, when a faint melody floated across the wind, so delicate it almost sounded human. I stopped mid-step, heart hammering, trying to convince myself it was a distant radio or the echo of machinery. But the notes wove through the air with purpose, melodic yet distorted, and a chill ran down my spine. I wasn't supposed to be near the edge alone, but something inside me, curiosity, foolishness, or maybe instinct, made me step closer. The skeptic from the first week, who had learned the hard way that the ocean doesn't forgive carelessness, was already there, leaning over the railing with a mix of fear and fascination. "It's probably just the currents interacting with the hull," he whispered, though his voice trembled. I wanted to argue, but the sirens, if that's what they were, shifted suddenly, rising and falling as though following the rig's movements. The sound was hypnotic, a rhythm that seemed to pulse inside my chest. I remembered the warnings the veterans had muttered. The sirens weren't just noise, they were a test, and those who tried to face them alone never returned the same. As we watched, the melody twisted, becoming something almost intelligible. I thought I heard my name, a whisper carried on the wind and across the steel beams. "Did you hear that?" I asked. But the skeptic shook his head, looking over his shoulder at the dark water. "It's nothing, it's just echoes," he said, though his usual bravado was gone. I could feel the pressure mounting in the pit of my stomach, a sense that the ocean itself was drawing me toward the edge. Every instinct screamed that stepping closer would be a mistake, yet the sirens beckoned, distant and terrifying, promising truths no human should witness. The rig groaned under the weight of the waves, and I realized that the lights were flickering in sync with the siren's melody. Shadows danced across the deck, elongating and contracting unnaturally. I tried to focus on the task at hand, checking valves, securing equipment, but the sound drew my gaze repeatedly back toward the black water. Suddenly, a small splash erupted near the outer platform, and the skeptic stumbled back with a yell, claiming he'd seen a figure rise briefly above the surface. His panic made me hesitate, unsure whether to move closer or retreat, and in that instant, the siren's song changed, rising in pitch and intensity, like it was aware of our indecision. I could feel the pull of it, like gravity, invisible yet irresistible. My thoughts spun with warnings from the old-timers, each story echoing in my mind. Crews lured into the depths, hatches left open, bodies never found, eyes watching from the black beyond. The skeptic's earlier defiance evaporated as he gripped my arm, whispering, "We shouldn't be here. We need to get back." But even together, our steps toward the safety of the rig's center felt heavy, slow, as if the deck itself resisted us. The siren's melody lingered, sinking into my mind, a persistent tug that left me dizzy and disoriented. Then, the water beneath the platform shifted violently. I saw shapes moving just beneath the surface, impossible to identify, elongated and black, writhing like living shadows. The skeptic grabbed a railing and froze, muttering, "It's coming for us." I didn't respond. My throat tightened, and I realized that no explanation, currents, reflection, hallucination, could account for the deliberate, intelligent motion below. The sirens rose to a crescendo, and I felt it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to align with my heartbeat, urging me forward. Step by step, I forced myself to retreat, the deck groaning beneath our feet, shadows clinging to the edges as if alive. A sudden scream cut through the night. One of the newer crew members, who had ignored the warning about the sirens, had stepped onto the outer catwalk earlier, and now was gone. His voice had barely left his lips before silence swallowed it, and the only trace left was a ripple, spreading across the otherwise calm water. I stared in disbelief, my heart thundering, realizing that the sirens hadn't just been calling, they had claimed. The skeptic grabbed my arm, panic clear in his eyes, and we both sprinted toward the main deck, each step echoing in the darkness, as though the rig itself were holding its breath. By the time we reached the central platform, drenched and trembling, the melody had faded to a whisper. The lights steadied, but the shadows seemed thicker, darker, like the ocean had left an imprint on everything around us. I could barely speak, my mind spinning with what had just happened, replaying every detail of the water, the shapes, and the impossibly precise timing of the siren's song. Even the skeptic was silent, his usual sarcasm replaced with a grim understanding. We had survived, barely, but the night had marked us, etched a warning deeper than any rule could convey. In the days that followed, we learned to anticipate the sirens. Their appearances weren't random, they came at precise intervals, often during night shifts, when the rig was quiet and the crew isolated. Even small movements toward the edges became exercises in anxiety, our eyes scanning the black water constantly, listening for the faintest melody that could signal the beginning of another hunt. I found myself avoiding areas I had once walked freely, leaving tasks for others, if they required venturing near the outer platforms. The rig felt alive, breathing with us and against us, a constant reminder that disobedience could be fatal. We also noticed that the sirens affected perception. Crew members swore they saw figures walking on the water, glimpses of faces in the waves, shadows that mimicked human motion but dissolved when approached. One night, I glimpsed a shape that seemed to resemble my own reflection, rising from the water with hollow, empty eyes. The skeptic, now visibly shaken, admitted he had seen similar things, and together we realized the sirens weren't just sounds. They were manipulations, pulling our attention, testing our judgment, and preying on fear. It was impossible to ignore them, impossible to confront them alone. By the third week, the rig's routine had changed. Shifts were now paired carefully. No one went near the edges without a partner. Communication became frantic when the melody started, eyes darting toward each other, and the water simultaneously. Even brief separations led to panic, as if the ocean itself could exploit the smallest lapse. I caught myself hesitating before every task, imagining the pull of the sirens, and the growing fear in the crew created an unspoken bond. We were trapped in this rhythm, bound to each other's survival, and I knew any solo movement near the water would be a fatal mistake. Then came the night the sirens changed. The melody wasn't distant anymore. It seemed to surge from below the rig, vibrating through the steel and into our bones. Shadows on the water shifted faster, more deliberate, and I saw movement in the floodlight's reflection, shapes that defied natural motion. The skeptic and I clung to each other, shouting for the others to return, but the sound intensified, pressing in on us like a living entity. Panic gripped the platform as one crew member screamed, breaking away from the group and heading toward the catwalk. By the time we reached him, he was gone, leaving only ripples spreading across the black water. The sirens quieted, and a silence heavier than the ocean itself settled over us. After that night, no one questioned the rule again. Pairing became mandatory. Every moment near the edges required multiple eyes. Even simple tasks were now exercises in observation, communication, and trust. The sirens became a constant presence, a measure of how far the ocean could reach without breaking the rig itself. I learned to listen for the faintest hints of melody, to anticipate the vibrations in the steel, and to respect the invisible boundary they created. Survival was no longer just about skill, it was about awareness, obedience, and understanding that even a single step alone could cost a life. And still the fear never fully left me. Every time I patrolled the deck or checked the outer platforms, I felt the pull, faint yet insistent, reminding me that the sirens were always listening, always waiting. The rig had become a cage and a sanctuary at once, the boundary between life and the depths, and I understood that no one would ever truly master it. One misstep, one moment of recklessness, and the ocean would remind you why the rule existed. It was relentless, patient, and completely indifferent to human arrogance. By the time the shadows began to move independently, I knew why the old-timers had insisted Rule 3, never investigate the shadows alone. That night, after the sirens had withdrawn into their distant mocking hum, I noticed a dark shape lingering at the edge of the floodlights on the lower platform. My curiosity screamed at me to step closer, but instinct kept me rooted. The shape was impossible to define. Sometimes it appeared like a person, other times like a writhing mass of blackness. I could hear the faint scrape of steel below my boots, though no one was walking near me. The air itself seemed to thrum with tension, vibrating in sync with my heartbeat. I called out, "Who's there?" But the words were swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness of the rig. For a moment, the shadow remained still, then stretched toward me, impossible angles, bending as if gravity itself obeyed a different law there. My stomach turned, and I thought about how the sirens had drawn our attention the week before. I realized the shadows weren't random. They were tests, probes, warnings, and anything approaching them alone was a dangerous gamble. Every instinct told me to retreat, but my training, my curiosity, and some foolish need to understand compelled me forward, inch by trembling inch. The skeptic appeared suddenly from behind a stairwell, grabbing my shoulder and whispering, "Don't go any closer." His voice was urgent, tight with fear, confirming that even the hardened among us understood the stakes. The shadow responded almost immediately, shifting its shape, creeping along the outer deck like it could sense our awareness. I could see a reflection of our feet in the wet steel beneath, yet the shadow didn't correspond with either of our movements. The rig felt like it had split into two realities, one safe and familiar, the other dark and alive, luring the unwary into its depths. I tried to reason aloud. It's probably just a reflection, maybe the lights, some kind of optical illusion. The skeptic didn't respond. His wide eyes betrayed the acknowledgement we both knew to be true. The shadow continued to grow, a twisting, undulating form that pressed toward the center of the deck. My pulse raced, sweat running down my back despite the chill, and I felt a pull toward the unknown, a magnetic force stronger than gravity itself. Every instinct screamed at me to step back, but the human part of me, a foolish, stubborn curiosity, kept inching forward. A sudden vibration ran through the steel beneath our boots, subtle but undeniable, almost like a pulse from the shadow itself. I froze, noticing that even the floodlights seemed dimmer where the shape lingered. The skeptic grabbed my arm, tight enough to leave marks, and hissed, "If you step one more foot alone, you'll disappear like the others." I wanted to argue, to insist that logic could explain this, but the sensation of being watched from all directions silenced me. The shadow moved faster now, slipping across the deck in ways that defied our understanding, and I realized the danger wasn't the physical entity itself, but the act of confronting it in isolation. Every tool and piece of equipment I carried suddenly felt heavier, an absurd weight pressing against my awareness. I backed up slowly, eyes fixed on the twisting mass, trying to calculate a safe distance. The skeptic kept low, crouching beside me, whispering frantic reassurances as we made our way toward the central platform. The shadows seemed to pulse in response, ebbing and flowing as if alive, but never following our precise movements, always just close enough to remind us of their presence. I realized then that the rig's labyrinth of corridors and steel walkways wasn't just architecture. It was a defense mechanism, keeping us away from areas where the shadows could reach out unchecked. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Every corner of the rig I turned revealed new forms, elongated silhouettes, glimpses of faces without features, masses of darkness that didn't belong to any human or machine. The skeptic whispered that some crew members had tried to map the shadows months earlier and failed, going mad in the attempt. I could see why. Our senses were overwhelmed. The mind struggled to comprehend something that constantly defied logic and physics. Even a single glance could unhinge perception, and I felt the shadows probing, testing, judging. They weren't corporeal yet. They were intent, aware and waiting for an opportunity. As the night deepened, the rig's floodlights began flickering again, synchronized with the shadows' movements. The sound of distant metal groaning amplified the tension, making it feel as if the rig itself shivered in fear. The skeptic and I huddled together, refusing to move toward any edge. I realized then that our earlier mistakes, stepping near the sirens alone, had made us acutely sensitive to these shadows. Any attempt to investigate them solo was a trap. The shadows didn't just threaten life, they toyed with perception, made you question reality, and could claim you without leaving a trace. Suddenly, a crew member emerged from the stairwell, eyes wide with terror. "I thought I saw someone down there," he stammered, pointing toward the shadows pooling near a maintenance hatch. He froze as the shape seemed to coil upward, almost teasing, almost alive. The skeptic and I restrained him, dragging him back to the main deck. "You have to stay with us," I said, though my own voice wavered. "Alone you're gone before you realize it." He nodded, trembling, and I knew none of us would ever forget this night. Shadows were not obstacles to confront. They were sentinels, ever present, aware of anyone who dared approach without another. We spent the remainder of the night, clustered near the central deck, watching the shadows writhe along the periphery, never approaching us as a group, yet always present, a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and disappearance. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every vibration of steel, every flicker of light, sent a shiver down my spine. I thought about those who had ignored warnings, the ones who had ventured out alone in previous weeks. They didn't just vanish, they became part of the rig's memory, etched into the darkness that waited for the next mistake. By dawn, the shadows had receded somewhat, melting into the water and steel, like smoke blown by the wind, but their presence lingered. Even in daylight, faint traces remained, odd patterns of wetness on the deck, unusual streaks of light in the floodlights, a whisper of movement in peripheral vision. The skeptic didn't speak much that morning, and neither did I. We had learned that some knowledge was too dangerous to share, too immediate to dismiss. The shadows were patient, intelligent, and relentless, and the rig's rules existed not to restrict us, but to protect us from their calculated attention. As the weeks went on, our patrols and maintenance routines adapted. No one went near the lower decks or external platforms alone, and group vigilance became instinctive. Crew members would glance at each other constantly, even when performing routine checks, listening for the faintest hint of movement that suggested shadows were near. The air on the rig carried tension, thick and constant, as though the shadow's presence seeped into the very steel. Each night, we prepared ourselves mentally, anticipating the subtle cues that heralded their approach. We learned that staying together wasn't just a rule, it was the difference between returning to the central deck alive or becoming another vanished story. Even now, I can feel the weight of that first encounter whenever I step near the edge. The shadows aren't gone, they wait, ever patient, and the memory of the crew member nearly lost that night serves as a constant warning. The rig is alive in ways that defy logic, and the shadows are its eyes and hands. No matter how careful, how experienced, or how rational we think we are, their awareness is absolute, and the risk of going alone remains fatal. The memory of that night, the twisting forms, and the pull of the unknown continue to haunt me with every step, every shift, every sound that echoes from the blackness beyond. The first time I truly understood Rule 4. Never ignore the pressure alarms. The rig had been eerily quiet after the shadows receded, and I was performing routine checks alone in the control chamber. The faint, low hum of machinery was suddenly broken by the shrill blare of a pressure alarm, somewhere deep in the lower hull. My stomach dropped. The indicator lights flashed a deep red, warning of abnormal readings far beyond acceptable limits. I hesitated for a moment, considering the possibility of a false trigger, but the memory of the sirens and shadows from the past week made me freeze. Every instinct told me this was not a drill, not a minor mechanical glitch, and not something I could afford to dismiss. I grabbed the headset and contacted the supervisor on the main deck, my voice tight. "Pressure alarm in Section 7B. I'm checking it." There was static on the line before the reply, and when it came, it was unusually terse. "Do not enter alone. Wait for backup." I felt a twinge of fear because waiting meant that something unknown could be escalating below, and the shadows still lingered in my mind. My hands trembled as I keyed the elevator to the lower levels, realizing that obeying rules wasn't just bureaucracy, it was a survival tactic. Even the skeptic, now reluctantly cautious, would never have dared descend without confirmation. The elevator groaned and rattled, taking longer than usual to reach the lower hull. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the steel walls, and I could hear the faint drip of water echoing in the distance. The rig seemed to breathe around me, the vibration of the engines resonating in my chest like a warning pulse. I reached the access hatch and pried it open slowly, the smell of salt and metal rushing in like a cold slap. The pressure gauge on the wall indicated an alarming spike, far beyond what could be considered safe, and a faint mist began rising from the floor grates. I realized immediately that ignoring this would be catastrophic. I radioed the main deck again, levels rising fast, need immediate support. There was only static in response, making my heartbeat pound louder than the alarms themselves. I forced myself to take measured steps across the slick steel catwalk, each footfall amplified by the hollow space beneath. Shadows danced along the walls, reflections of pipes and machinery creating shapes that were not entirely real, and my mind struggled to differentiate between mechanical anomalies and lingering effects of the shadows I had witnessed earlier. Every instinct screamed that I was dangerously alone, and yet I couldn't retreat. The rig itself was holding a secret that demanded attention. A sudden vibration ran through the hull, stronger than anything I'd experienced before. Pipes shook violently, and I could hear the deep groan of stressed metal echoing across the compartment. I tried to steady myself, gripping the railings, but the mist rising from the grates obscured the floor. My flashlight cut through the haze, revealing warped reflections of the steel walls and hints of shapes moving just beyond the beam. I swallowed hard, realizing that the rig was no longer just a workplace. It was a living entity reacting to some unseen force in the depths. I wished I had waited for backup, but I also knew that hesitation could make the difference between life and death. Suddenly, the skeptic appeared at the end of the walkway, his flashlight beam intersecting mine. "I couldn't stay on the deck any longer," he whispered, voice low and shaking. "Something's down here. I can feel it." His presence was both a relief and a warning. The shadows had taught us that isolation magnifies danger. Together, we traced the source of the pressure spike, moving cautiously, avoiding any suspicious ripples or vibrations in the steel beneath our feet. Each step made the rig groan in response, a deep, ominous sound that seemed almost sentient. The pressure readings climbed, and I realized that whatever force was affecting the hull didn't need to be physical. It was influencing the machinery, the environment, and our very nerves. We reached the main valve room for Section 7B, where the alarms were centered, and I saw something impossible. The pressure meters were oscillating wildly, as if obeying a rhythm, rising and falling in sync with a pulse I couldn't identify. The skeptic and I exchanged a glance, both understanding that this was not mechanical failure. It was something else, something that had learned how to manipulate the rig itself. I tried to operate the manual overrides, but the steel handles resisted, as though the rig itself were fighting us. Every movement I made was accompanied by an uneasy feeling, like unseen eyes tracking my hands, judging my every motion. I managed to stabilize one of the smaller valves, but the main pressure spike remained, climbing faster than physics should allow. A sudden jolt rocked the entire hull, sending us both sprawling. The mist thickened, almost suffocating, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows beyond the control panels. It was a mass of darkness, writhing like the shadows I had seen before, but now it seemed tied to the pressure anomaly, almost as if it were feeding off it. The skeptic whispered, "We need to get out, now," but I realized that leaving meant abandoning the hull to forces we didn't understand, possibly triggering catastrophic failure. I forced myself to continue, crawling along the walkway to reach the final control console. The meters spun uncontrollably, alarms blaring, and the mist turned into a rolling fog that clung to our clothes and skin. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, yet the fear of ignoring the readings drove me onward. I could hear the distant hum of the sirens echoing faintly, and the shadows seemed to twitch in response, coiling along the walls and floor. I felt the rig itself shift slightly underfoot, steel vibrating as though alive, and the thought struck me, the rules were not arbitrary, they were survival, etched into the experience of those who had disappeared before us. Finally, with a combination of brute force and careful observation, I managed to recalibrate one of the main valves, causing a slight reduction in the pressure. The alarm's pitch changed, signaling a temporary stabilization, but the mist remained thick, curling around pipes and grates, and I could still see the unnatural movement in the shadows. The skeptic leaned against the railing, breathing heavily, and muttered, "We barely made it." I didn't respond, my focus fixed on the subtle signs in the steel and water, noting every twitch, every reflection, every distortion in the fog. This was far from over, and I understood why no one ignored these alarms. They weren't just machinery warnings. They were the rig communicating, warning us, testing our ability to survive. Hours later, when the mist finally began to dissipate, and the shadows retreated to corners where the floodlights didn't reach, I realized the true danger wasn't the pressure itself, but the combination of environmental anomalies and unseen forces. Ignoring the alarms would have meant giving up control entirely, letting the rig and the ocean conspire to claim another victim. The skeptic and I moved silently back to the main deck, haunted by every creak, vibration, and flicker of light along the way. By the time we reached safety, exhaustion had settled into our bones, but the lesson was clear. These warnings were precise, deliberate, and deadly. From that night on, no alarm was ignored. The crew's routine changed, inspections became obsessive, and every minor fluctuation in readings was taken seriously. The rig demanded attention, respect, and adherence to the invisible boundaries set by the previous tragedies. Every time a sensor tripped, every subtle vibration in the steel reminded us of what could happen in a heartbeat. I had survived the shadows, the sirens, and now the pressures, but the rig's lessons were far from over. Each rule stacked upon the last, a chain of survival with no room for error. Even now I feel the lingering tremor in the lower hull, the memory of the mist curling around my boots, the shadows moving just beyond vision. The alarms were not simply mechanical, they were the rig's pulse, a warning system that we could never ignore. Ignoring them meant risking everything, and I would never forget the terror of that night, the combination of unseen forces, environmental hazards, and the oppressive awareness that we were not alone. Survival demanded attention, vigilance, and absolute obedience to the lessons the rig had carved into my mind. I learned the importance of Rule 5. Never enter the flooded lower decks the night a minor leak turned into a cascading nightmare. It started as a thin stream trickling along the floor grates, almost insignificant, but I could hear the faint, persistent drip echoing through the hollow steel corridors. I paused, flashlight beam cutting through the dimly lit passage, noticing the reflection of the water curling unnaturally along the walls. The rig, already tense from the pressure alarm incident, seemed to tighten around me. Shadows danced on the edges of the water, forming shapes that shouldn't have been possible, reminding me that beneath the flooded deck lay the unpredictable, malevolent force of the deep. I radioed the control room, my voice unnaturally tight. Leak in Section 9D, water level rising fast. Static replied for a moment, before the supervisor's voice finally came through, grave and precise. Do not go down there alone. Wait for assistance. My instinct screamed at me that waiting was dangerous. The water was spreading faster than predicted, and the shadows from previous nights seemed to have migrated to the edges of my flashlight. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming that I should step back, yet the compulsion to assess and secure the area pulled me toward the flooded corridor. The skeptic, who had survived the shadows and the sirens, appeared at the mouth of the lower deck. "I'll go with you," he said, voice low but tense. The reassurance was immediate, though fleeting, as the oppressive air of the submerged corridors pressed down on us. We descended the steel ladder into the shallow pool, and I realized how deceptively fast the water could conceal dangers. Every ripple, every small reflection, could hide something reaching upward. The eerie silence in the flooded area was overwhelming, only broken by our own splashes, each sound amplified as though the rig itself was listening. I gripped the railing tightly, feeling the slick surface beneath my boots. "The readings are climbing again," I muttered, scanning the walls for any indication of leaks or stress points. Shadows formed at the edges, bending and twisting, as if in anticipation of movement. The skeptic whispered, "Keep your eyes on the gauges, don't look at the edges too long." I realized he wasn't exaggerating. The previous nights had taught us that fixation on the shadows alone could make you lose track of the real physical danger: unstable steel, rising water, and unseen currents pushing against the rig's hull. Every decision became a calculated risk, and one misstep could send either of us plummeting into the flooded abyss. The water began to swirl unnaturally around the central grating, forming eddies that seemed to have intention. My flashlight caught glimpses of something dark beneath the surface, shapes that moved too deliberately, fluid yet purposeful. "Did you see that?" I whispered, heart pounding, pointing toward a shadow that vanished the instant he looked. The skeptic nodded, eyes wide, tightening his grip on the railing. "It's feeding off the water," he murmured. "The rig warned us for a reason. Don't let it touch you." I swallowed hard, realizing that the flooded decks were not merely a physical hazard. They were an extension of the shadows and sirens, a new environment where the rig and the ocean's unknown forces could collaborate to punish curiosity. A sudden vibration ran through the steel beneath us, stronger than anything I had felt before. Pipes rattled and the water surged slightly, washing over our boots with surprising force. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the far end of the corridor, where the water level seemed to rise faster. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, yet every fiber of my being felt drawn forward, as if the water itself had awareness. The skeptic tightened his hold on my arm, whispering again that we needed to retreat. But the leak's origin lay just ahead, and we had no choice but to confront it directly, or risk it spreading uncontrollably. The further we moved, the darker the water became. My flashlight illuminated fleeting shapes beneath the surface, elongated forms, twisting like shadows, moving in ways the water shouldn't allow. The skeptic and I exchanged tense glances, knowing instinctively that the shadows had integrated into the flooded decks. Every movement of our boots caused small ripples, each ripple feeding whatever lurked beneath. It became clear that the water itself was alive with attention, reacting to our presence, testing our resolve. One miscalculated step could trigger an unseen reaction, potentially pulling one of us beneath the surface instantly. We reached the origin of the leak, a ruptured pipe spilling water at an alarming rate. I could see the pressure gauges swinging wildly, and the water level rising faster than anticipated. I tried to secure the valve manually, but the force of the water pressed against my legs, threatening to knock me off balance. The shadows below writhed with more urgency now, responding to our interference. I felt the chilling certainty that this was a trap, a scenario designed to see who could maintain composure and who would succumb to panic. My lungs tightened, not from the exertion, but from the awareness that the water had become an entity that was observing, calculating, and reacting. A muffled sound echoed from the far end of the flooded corridor, barely perceptible, but distinctly human. My pulse skyrocketed, realizing that a crew member must have ignored the rule and ventured alone. The skeptic froze beside me, whispering that this was exactly what the warnings had been about. Alone, any mistake was fatal. My imagination struggled to separate the rational possibility of a fellow crew member from the terror-inducing presence beneath the surface. Shapes rose briefly from the water, darker and more substantial than mere reflections, then sank without a trace, leaving us shaken and questioning reality. Hours seemed to pass as we battled both the flood and the shadows. Every valve we secured required delicate manipulation, careful foot placement, and constant awareness of the dark shapes weaving beneath the surface. My flashlight illuminated occasional glimpses of what appeared to be humanoid figures, but I knew better. They were echoes, reflections, and the manipulation of our senses. The skeptic and I moved as one, communication minimal, hearts pounding, each aware that a single misstep could let the water and the shadows claim us in tandem. The rig had become a labyrinth of hazards, and the flooded decks were now its deadliest room. When the leak finally slowed, the shadows receded into the depths, leaving only ripples and reflections that suggested motion even in stillness. My legs trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline, and the skeptic sank onto the central grating, breathing heavily. "We survived," he whispered, though the tension in his voice betrayed the lingering fear. I nodded silently, knowing that surviving wasn't triumph, it was temporary reprieve. The flooded decks had tested everything: courage, coordination, and discipline. Ignoring the rule could have meant immediate disappearance, and the memory of what had almost dragged us under would haunt every shift for the rest of our deployment. From that night forward, every crew member adhered strictly to Rule 5. Paired patrols became mandatory, and even minor maintenance tasks were scheduled with multiple eyes present. The rig demanded obedience, not as punishment, but as a safeguard against forces no human could control. The shadows, the sirens, and the unpredictable water beneath the deck were a constant reminder of our fragility. Every splash, ripple, and subtle movement of steel reminded us that even a momentary lapse could result in immediate danger. The lower decks were no longer just a part of the rig, they were a sentinel, a trap, and a lesson. Even now, whenever I pass the flooded corridors during routine checks, I feel the lingering weight of that night. The water seems to cling to the edges of my vision, shadows just below the surface, waiting for the unwary. I remember every vibration, every whisper of movement, every subtle shift that nearly drew us in. The rig had taught me, through near catastrophe, that obedience was not optional. It was the difference between returning to the central deck alive or vanishing into the cold, dark depths forever. Rule 5 was no longer a guideline, it was a contract with survival itself. It was during a routine maintenance dive outside the rig that I first realized the deadly truth of Rule 6. Never ignore the deep-sea currents. The water seemed calm at the surface, deceptively serene, but as soon as I descended past the protective barriers of the rig, the ocean revealed its hidden force. I felt my body pushed sideways by invisible hands, currents twisting with strength that defied my training. My dive partner, normally confident and composed, yelled through our comms, "Stay close, don't let it separate us." But even tethered to the rig, I could feel the water tugging, pulling, and testing my resistance. The ocean was alive in a way I had never truly experienced. Shadows of enormous undulating forms moved far beneath us, and the currents carried them as if they were part of some orchestrated ballet of menace. I tried to follow my checklist, inspect external hull, check anchors, monitor pressure gauges, but each task was interrupted by violent shifts in the water that forced me to grab at handrails or stabilize against pipes. The skeptic, also in the water, grunted as he struggled against the pull. "It's stronger than it should be," he gasped, his voice tight with panic. "The ocean, it's aware of us." I didn't respond. Words were useless against the tug of the abyss. Every step against the current felt like a battle. My muscles burned, adrenaline spiked, and yet the water seemed to anticipate every movement. It flowed around me, under me, over me, tugging at equipment and disorienting my sense of direction. I realized the currents weren't random. They had patterns, almost intelligence, guiding me, pushing me towards certain paths, pulling away from others. The further we ventured, the more the rig seemed to vanish behind us, the structure's familiar shapes reduced to shadowy outlines swallowed by the deep. The ocean had become a predator, testing our awareness, our stamina, and our adherence to the rules that had kept us alive. The skeptic tried to point out landmarks to help orient us, pipes, railings, external platforms, but the currents distorted everything. Even my own light seemed unreliable, flickering and stretching reflections across the water that suggested movement that wasn't there. I realized that the shadows we had feared inside the rig weren't confined to its walls. They followed us, moving with the currents, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always observing, always waiting for hesitation. My chest tightened as panic gnawed at me, reminding me that the ocean doesn't forgive mistakes, and the rule existed for a reason. I struggled to stabilize near a maintenance hatch when the current suddenly surged, stronger than before, bending my tether and forcing me face first into the steel wall. Water rushed past my mask, blurring my vision, and I felt my senses slip, my depth perception, my orientation, even my confidence. The skeptic grabbed my arm, whispering, "Don't let go, fight it." I could feel the ocean's resistance as something more than physical, a presence that seemed to study our weaknesses, our reactions, our fear. Every movement required precision and patience, every breath carefully measured, as if the currents themselves judged our competence. As we navigated toward the external anchoring points, I noticed changes in the water, that defied logic. Small whirlpools formed without reason, ripples that contradicted the surrounding flow, shadows that twisted along the ocean floor, as if dancing in sync with our movements. I tried to rationalize, blaming tides, underwater vents, or turbulence, but instinct screamed that this was something alive, something aware of us. The skeptic, who had challenged nearly every rule in his life, swallowed hard, muttering, "We shouldn't be down here alone ever." His fear was contagious, amplifying my own anxiety and making every shift in the current feel like a deliberate attempt to separate us. Minutes felt like hours as we fought through the water. The rig's structure, normally a comforting reference, was reduced to distant, wavering silhouettes. Every glance downward revealed shifting shadows and faint echoes, perhaps our own movements, perhaps something more, resonated through the water. I thought about the flooded decks, the sirens, the shadows, and the pressure alarms. Every rule had led to this moment, preparing us to survive a situation we were barely equipped to endure. Ignoring the currents would have meant instant disorientation, separation, and likely death, an invisible trap that the rig and ocean conspired to enforce. Then a sudden tug nearly tore my tether free. I slammed my hand on the rail, feeling the steel vibrate unnaturally beneath my grip. Something in the current shifted, a dark mass surging past, almost brushing my arm. I didn't see it clearly, but the force was undeniable. The skeptic shouted, "It's testing us. It knows our limits." My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just natural turbulence. The ocean, the shadows, the rig, they were all linked, conspiring to ensure that disobedience or miscalculation was punished immediately. The currents were a gatekeeper, separating the careful from the reckless. We pressed on, methodically checking bolts and anchors, but every minor movement required more effort than physics should allow. The water's behavior changed unpredictably, small eddies forming and vanishing, currents reversing without warning, and shadows gliding beneath us, always just beyond reach. I felt the presence of something enormous, lurking beneath, adjusting the flow around us, forcing us to recognize our vulnerability. My lungs burned, every fin stroke deliberate, as I silently repeated the mantra of Rule 6 in my head: never ignore the currents, never underestimate their force, never separate from your partner. Finally, we reached the farthest external platform, where the tethers could be secured, and the currents slightly less oppressive. The water was still alive, still twisting and pushing, but we were momentarily stabilized. Both of us gasped for air through our masks, trembling, staring at the shadowy expanse around us. I realized that this rule, like the others, existed not for convenience, but as a lifeline, a hard-earned guideline, forged from the mistakes of those who had vanished before us. The deep-sea currents were invisible predators, indifferent yet intelligent, and disobedience was never forgiven. Hours later, safely back on the main deck, I recounted every detail to the other crew members. We understood that the currents weren't just water in motion. They were extensions of the rig's deadly environment, controlled by forces we couldn't see, but could always feel. Even experienced divers avoided them alone, and I knew that any solo venture would invite disaster. The lesson was seared into my memory. Awareness, caution, and partnership were the only defenses against the ocean's invisible claws. The rig had demanded obedience once more, and it would not hesitate again. Even now, whenever I prepare for a dive near the rig's exterior, I can feel the faint tug of the deep-sea currents, a silent reminder of how small and insignificant we are against the ocean. Shadows lurk beneath, the rig's steel vibrates in subtle warnings, and I never descend without a partner. The lesson of Rule 6 isn't just about the water, it's about humility, vigilance, and respect for forces beyond human understanding. Survival depends on acknowledging that some things cannot be controlled, only respected, and the currents are one of the ocean's cruelest teachers. The first time I truly understood Rule 7, never touch the bioluminescent growths, it was during an external inspection on the rig's deepest submerged platforms. The eerie glow of the growths illuminated the steel in ghostly patterns, casting everything around me in shifting blues and greens. My dive partner, usually cautious but increasingly curious, reached out toward one of the clusters, whispering, "It's just algae. Beautiful, right?" I grabbed his arm sharply, fear overtaking reason. The growths weren't harmless. The glow pulsed in rhythm with something unseen, almost alive. An instinct screamed that contact would trigger consequences far beyond our understanding. As soon as his fingers brushed the surface, the water thickened unnaturally around us. It wasn't turbulence, it was resistance, subtle but deliberate, as if the ocean itself recoiled. Shadows we had learned to fear rippled across the steel, following the light, interacting with it in ways I could barely comprehend. I yelled, "Get back, don't touch it." But the skeptic, skeptical as ever, had already pulled his hand away, leaving faint, glowing streaks in the water where the growths had reacted. The pulse of the light intensified, vibrating through my gloves and suit, sending a shiver through my entire body. I realized immediately that Rule 7 wasn't a suggestion. It was a boundary separating life from the abyss. We tried to proceed with our inspection, focusing on the rig's hull and anchor points, but the glowing streaks had attracted attention. Shadows moved faster, closer, pressing along the edges of our lights. The bioluminescent patches seemed to have multiplied, now covering portions of the steel beams and grates in a living, shifting pattern. Every time our fins kicked water near them, the growths pulsed violently, and the current seemed to respond, tugging more forcefully. I whispered urgently through the comms, "We follow the path away from the glow, don't let it spread onto the platform." My words barely penetrated the tension that had wrapped itself around our limbs and lungs. The skeptic hesitated, glancing at a particularly radiant cluster. "It's mesmerizing," he admitted, his voice trembling, "almost like it's aware of us." I nodded grimly, understanding the truth behind his fear. The glow wasn't merely aesthetic, it was signaling, communicating, and possibly controlling. The shadows, the currents, and the bioluminescent growths were now intertwined, an ecosystem of hazards the rig had warned us about through its unspoken rules. Each pulse of light seemed to draw the shadows closer, weaving them into the water, binding the unseen forces of the deep to the rig's steel skeleton. As we advanced cautiously, I noticed subtle changes in the pressure readings near the clusters. Small vibrations ran through the metal beneath our boots, synchronized with the pulsing glow. It was almost musical in rhythm, eerie yet purposeful, and I felt the unmistakable pull of the abyss toward the growths. The skeptic whispered again, "If we ignore this, it could pull us down." I didn't need confirmation. Instinct told me that touching or disturbing the growths would have consequences we couldn't survive. The glowing patches were not just decoration, they were part of a defense mechanism, a lure and a sentinel rolled into one. I forced myself to focus on securing the rig's maintenance lines, deliberately avoiding the patches as we moved along. The water itself seemed to thicken near the clusters, slowing our movements. Each flick of my flashlight caused the growths to shimmer more intensely, almost like they were aware of being observed. Shadows twisted in response, converging near the edges of the glow without ever fully emerging. The skeptic's face was pale, lips pressed tight as he mirrored my careful movements, understanding that a single touch or careless gesture could invite a rapid, possibly fatal reaction from the environment around us. At one point, I caught a glimpse of something far below the platform, a faint outline illuminated by the bioluminescence. It was massive, fluid and impossible to identify, moving with deliberate intent beneath the steel beams. My chest tightened, realizing that the growths might act as bait, drawing attention from forces larger and more dangerous than we could imagine. I shouted to the skeptic, "Keep moving, don't slow down," and we pressed along the platform, each careful fin stroke deliberate and measured. I felt the current subtly shift around us, responding to both our proximity to the glowing clusters and the unspoken presence beneath the water. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we navigated the luminous maze. The shadows intertwined with the glow, forming dark patterns that clung to the steel in impossible angles. I could feel my nerves fraying, the tension building with each step as I realized that any error, any accidental contact, could provoke a reaction from forces beyond comprehension. The skeptic, normally brash, moved with a newfound reverence, and I silently commended him for listening, knowing that survival demanded adherence to Rule 7 above all else in this part of the rig. Finally, we reached a section where the growths thinned, leaving a corridor of relatively clear water. My muscles ached from resisting both the currents and the subtle pull of the glow. I glanced back, and the patches shimmered ominously, as if tracking our retreat. The shadows followed suit, sliding along the edges, but never venturing fully into our path. I realized then that the bioluminescent growths were not merely hazards, they were guides, warnings, and sentinels, part of a network of rules designed to keep us alive. The combination of light, shadow, and currents had been a test, and we had passed it by obeying, not challenging, the principle embedded in Rule 7. Back at the main deck, safe in the floodlights and steel confines of the rig, I recounted the encounter to the remaining crew. Everyone understood the implications. The bioluminescent growths were more than organic phenomena. They were extensions of the rig's defenses, reminders of the unseen life forms in the depths, and signals of the dangerous ecosystem beyond our perception. No one dared venture near them without a partner, and the rule became a cornerstone of our operations. Disobedience, even out of curiosity, would have meant instant, irreversible consequences in the water below. Even now, whenever I see the faint blue-green shimmer from the lower platforms, a chill runs through me. The water carries the subtle pulses of light like a heartbeat. The shadows still linger at the periphery, and the rig's steel hums faintly, as if acknowledging the rules we follow. Rule 7 is not optional. It is a boundary separating life from the deep ocean's silent, patient predators. Each time I prepare for a dive, I remind myself and my team, the bioluminescent growths are alive in more ways than we understand, and touching them is an invitation we cannot afford to accept. The moment the first high-pitched vibrations reverberated through the rig, I remembered Rule 8, never speak when the sirens begin, and felt my throat tighten instinctively. The sirens were different from any alarm, sharp and penetrating, yet almost hypnotic in their rhythm. My dive partner and I froze mid-step on the exterior platform, the water around us thickening, as though acknowledging our stillness. Shadows slid along the steel rails, moving closer without a sound, responding to the vibrations in the siren's song. I had broken silence once in the past, and I remembered the chaos it caused. Voices had drawn attention, and whatever lurked beneath had almost taken us both. "Stay calm," I whispered, barely moving my lips so the sound wouldn't escape fully. The skeptic nodded, tension written in every line of his body, realizing that even a quiet murmur could betray our position. The sirens pulsed again, and I could feel the vibrations not just in the water but through my bones, a resonating echo that seemed to command our attention. Each note carried a threat, a warning, a test, and I understood immediately that Rule 8 was more than protocol. It was instinctual survival. Speaking even a single word could invoke the wrath of the unseen forces in the abyss, drawing the shadows and currents directly to us. We pressed forward carefully, barely moving our fins, letting the siren guide us without resistance. Every movement of the rig, every subtle vibration in the steel beneath, synchronized with the siren's rhythm. I could see shapes in the water responding, shadows bending and stretching unnaturally, weaving into the light of our flashlights, like dancers following a silent conductor. My mind raced, remembering previous lessons. Currents, flooded decks, glowing clusters, all had rules we had obeyed, and the siren's song now demanded complete discipline. Breaking Rule 8 could undo all our hard-won survival, exposing us to forces far more intelligent and deadly than we imagined. I remembered the tale of a diver from years ago who had spoken during the siren, a story whispered among the crew with fear and reverence. He hadn't screamed, He had just uttered a question, and the shadows had converged instantly, faster than any natural movement, dragging him into the dark waters beyond the rig. I could still picture the cautionary tale in my mind. The currents rose, mist gathered unnaturally, and the siren's pulse seemed to thrum faster in response to his voice. It wasn't the rig's mechanics or the ocean's physics that had punished him. It was the breaking of silence itself. That lesson hung over me like a specter as I navigated the platform, every step deliberate, every breath measured. A sudden surge in the water threatened to knock us off balance, and instinctively, my lips parted slightly to warn the skeptic, but I forced myself to remain silent. The siren's vibrations intensified, almost as though it could sense even the intention to speak. Shadows surged around the beams, and faint shapes danced beneath the water in patterns that mirrored our movements. The skeptic's hand gripped mine, pressing down lightly, a silent command to maintain composure. Every fiber of my being screamed to break the silence, but Rule 8 was absolute. Survival required obedience, even if it meant suppressing the instinct to communicate during an extreme threat. We reached a junction where two external platforms met, and the water pulsed strangely, the currents responding to the siren. I realized then that the song wasn't merely a warning, it was a lure, calling attention to movement, sound, and fear. Shadows rippled around us, the glowing bioluminescent clusters flickering in response, highlighting the precariousness of our position. If we make it through this, I whispered mentally, forcing my thoughts inward, we survive because we listen, because we obey. Even the skeptic, who had defied nearly every other rule, understood the gravity of the siren's message. Silence had become more than a precaution, it was armor against the abyss. Suddenly a dark mass surged beneath the platform, and the currents whipped violently around our legs. The siren's song shifted, harmonizing with the movement of the shadow in a way that made my stomach churn. I could feel the water pulling slightly at our tethers, testing our discipline. One wrong sound, even a reflexive cough, could draw that shadow directly toward us. I froze completely, counting my heartbeats, letting the water dictate our pace, and following the rhythm of the siren like a delicate, deadly dance. Each second of obedience felt like an eternity, but I knew it was the only way to survive. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed before the siren finally subsided, fading into low, vibrating echoes across the hull. We exhaled in relief, though silently, our bodies trembling from tension and exertion. The shadows receded as the light from the rig illuminated the water, but the lesson was unforgettable. Rule 8 had not been a suggestion, it had been the line between life and immediate death. Speaking during the siren had consequences too swift and precise to comprehend. The rig, the ocean, and the unseen forces beneath were now fully aware of our obedience, and I understood that each rule was cumulative, a chain of survival we had barely mastered. Back on the main deck, safe under the steel lights and reinforced railings, I recounted our near catastrophe to the crew. Everyone nodded in silent acknowledgement, the weight of Rule 8 clear in their eyes. The sirens were not simply warnings, they were tests, sentinels, and enforcers, reminding us that obedience was the only defense against forces far beyond human comprehension. I could still feel the vibrations in my bones, a lingering reminder of how close we had come to losing everything, with just a single word. Even now, when the faint hum of the siren vibrates through the rig, I feel the tension creep back into my muscles. The shadows seem to twitch at the edges of my vision, and I remember the lesson clearly. Silence isn't passive, it's active defense. Rule 8 ensures that the abyss cannot locate you, that shadows and currents cannot claim you, and that the rig itself acknowledges your adherence. Speaking during the siren is an invitation, one we cannot survive. I had always been meticulous about my gear, but nothing drove the point home like Rule 9. Never remove your safety harness in the depths. That day, while performing external inspections near the rig's farthest submerged platform, the currents were stronger than usual, and the shadows from previous encounters lingered like dark smoke in the water. My harness was the only thing keeping me tethered to the rig, but a momentary lapse of concentration nearly convinced me to adjust it without securing the secondary clips. I caught myself, the memory of past disasters flashing in my mind, and realized instantly that a single misstep here could mean disappearance into the abyss. The skeptic, now visibly tense, noticed my hesitation. "Don't even think about it," he said, voice tight. "One slip, one loosened strap, and the ocean doesn't forgive." His words were chillingly true. I felt the rig's steel vibrate subtly under my gloves, as if sensing our vulnerability, the shadows weaving just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Each movement required deliberate precision, and my hands shook as I worked with the harness, double-checking each clip, each strap, ensuring nothing could fail. In this environment, Rule 9 wasn't just a guideline. It was the thin barrier between life and the crushing weight of the deep. As we navigated the external scaffolding, the shadows responded to our tethered presence, gliding along the beams, occasionally darting beneath the faint glow of bioluminescent growths nearby. The currents tugged insistently at our limbs, testing every weak point in our harnesses. I could see the skeptic's knuckles white as he gripped his line, eyes darting toward the shadows, anticipating any sudden movement. The rig itself groaned in subtle, ominous vibrations, amplifying our awareness of Rule 9. Removing a harness or losing connection to the steel structure wasn't merely careless, it was almost certainly fatal. A sudden surge in the current pushed me sideways, and my harness held firm, but the force was enough to jerk me off balance. I clutched the railings desperately, heart pounding, adrenaline spiking. The shadows twisted in the corners of my vision, moving faster now, as if attracted to the slight instability. The skeptic's voice came through the comms, low but urgent. "Hold tight, don't let the line slip." I felt every fiber of the tether dig into my gloves, a reminder that Rule 9 was not negotiable. The ocean beneath us, dark and infinite, had become a predator, and the harness was our only lifeline against it. Minutes felt like hours as we progressed, every movement a battle against currents, shadows, and our own fear. A faint pulse in the rig's structure synchronized with the tug of the ocean, a warning embedded deep in the steel. I glanced at my harness again, confirming each clip, each latch, each secure point, knowing that even the smallest mistake could trigger immediate disaster. The skeptic mirrored my movements, eyes darting constantly, silently communicating awareness and compliance. The tether wasn't just a physical safety device, it was a lifeline threaded with vigilance, discipline, and obedience to Rule 9. We reached a junction platform where a maintenance panel awaited inspection, and I felt the current intensify, swirling around the beams like living fingers. I had to remove a small panel to access the controls, but every instinct screamed not to loosen my harness beyond necessity. The shadows below moved in rhythmic patterns, almost as if measuring our adherence to protocol. I reminded myself internally, Rule 9 existed because the depths were alive with forces that didn't adhere to physics or reason. Removing or loosening a harness even slightly would mean instant, irreversible consequences, a lesson written in the disappearance of those who had failed before us. While I worked on the panel, a subtle vibration ran along the scaffolding, synchronized with the currents. My fingers hovered over the last latch, double-checking before moving it, when the skeptic whispered, "Don't breathe too loudly. The shadows are aware." I froze, realizing that every motion, every exhalation, every tactile adjustment could draw attention. The ocean and rig were testing our discipline. The harness was not just safety, it was a tether to life, a connection to reality in an environment that actively sought to erase it. Each second reinforced the unforgiving nature of Rule 9, and my awareness of potential danger sharpened to an almost unbearable level. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the panel was secured, readings stabilized, and the currents subsided just enough for us to move along safely. I glanced at my harness once more, feeling the comforting restraint, and realized that adherence to Rule 9 had saved us in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The shadows and the rig's vibrations seemed to recede slightly, acknowledging our compliance. The skeptic gave me a small nod, a silent confirmation that survival wasn't just skill or courage, it was obedience to the rules that the rig and the ocean demanded. Back on the main deck, I recounted the incident to the remaining crew with solemn gravity. Rule 9 was now more than a guideline, it was a doctrine. No one approached the external scaffolds without a harness, no adjustments were made without full double checks, and every new crew member was briefed extensively. The rig's harsh lessons, the shadows, and the ocean's unpredictable force ensured that Rule 9 would never be ignored again. One moment of negligence could result in immediate death, a risk far too great to entertain, and the memory of what nearly happened remains seared into our minds. Even now, when I prepare for a dive or inspect the rig's exterior, I can feel the weight of the harness and the pull of the depths beneath me. The shadows linger in peripheral vision, the currents whisper subtle threats, and the rig vibrates faintly, as though testing our awareness. I know that Rule 9 is more than safety. It is the boundary between life and vanishing into the abyss. Any lapse, any removal, any misstep could be the final act. Survival demands respect, vigilance, and absolute adherence. I had heard strange things before on the rig, but nothing compared to the moment I was reminded of Rule 10. Never respond to the voices in the water. It happened the night after the harness incident, when the ocean was unusually calm, and the rig vibrated with a low hum that carried into the steel corridors like a heartbeat. I had been patrolling the lower decks with the skeptic, flashlights in hand, when the comms crackled with faint whispers that didn't belong to any of us. The sound was subtle at first, like a conversation just out of reach, but as we moved closer to the observation port, it became clearer, impossibly clearer, as though someone was speaking our names directly into the water. The skeptic froze, his eyes darting to me with unspoken fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, though I already knew he had. My name was being spoken again, a perfect imitation of a voice I recognized. My sister's. She was thousands of miles away, safe on land, yet here, in the crushing depth of the deep ocean, her voice drifted through the comms, pleading softly for help. My instincts screamed to answer, to reach out, but the rule anchored me. I kept my mouth shut, gripping the flashlight tighter, while the skeptic pressed his palms against his ears, as though trying to block the impossible sound. The voices grew louder as we stood near the observation port, weaving through the current outside like a chorus of ghosts. Some were familiar, others strange, but all of them carried an intimacy that made them hard to ignore. One voice sounded exactly like our late supervisor, calling instructions as if he were alive and working alongside us. Another mimicked the skeptic's father, telling him to unclip his harness and step closer to the glass. I could see his jaw tense, his body leaning almost involuntarily, as though the ocean itself had hooked him with invisible strings. "Don't listen," I muttered firmly, forcing him to snap back to awareness. Not a word, not a sound. We backed away slowly, but the voices followed, not through the comms this time, but vibrating faintly in the very walls of the rig. Every beam, every pipe, seemed to carry a whisper, a suggestion, a call. Some begged for help, others gave commands, and a few laughed with cruel familiarity. It was as if the ocean was peeling memories out of our minds and spitting them back at us in twisted form. I remembered the stories of crew members who had broken Rule 10. Those who spoke back, even once, were never the same again. Some walked willingly into the sea, others tore at their suits until the depths claimed them, and the few who survived were left hollow, repeating voices that no one else could hear. As the hours dragged on, the skeptic grew restless, his resolve weakening under the relentless barrage of sound. He muttered under his breath, half responses that made my stomach clench with fear. I grabbed his arm and hissed, "Don't give them anything." His eyes were glazed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold air. He admitted he had heard his mother's voice begging him to open the outer hatch, promising safety if he obeyed. I shook him hard, reminding him that it wasn't her, it was never her, but the ocean pretending. the shadows bending truth into traps. Rule 10 wasn't superstition, it was survival against manipulation so intimate it could fracture a mind. Later that night, while checking equipment on the subdeck, I heard my own name again, this time spoken in my father's tone. He had passed away years ago, yet the voice was exact, warm, reassuring, everything I remembered and longed to hear again. My chest tightened, a wave of grief washing over me, and for a second I nearly spoke back. The word Dad hovered at the edge of my tongue, but I swallowed it like poison. I knew if I said it aloud, the ocean would take more than my voice. It would take me. Instead, I turned off my comms entirely and forced myself to hum quietly, something human to drown out the inhuman. The skeptic wasn't as strong. By morning I found him standing too close to the open access hatch, lips moving silently. His harness was still on, but barely secured, and his eyes were fixed on the water as if expecting someone to rise from it. I yanked him back, and he snapped out of it, horrified at how far he had drifted without realizing. He admitted that he had answered once, just once, when the voice of his daughter had called his name. Nothing immediate happened, but since then, he said, the voices hadn't stopped. Even when the rig was quiet, even when his comms were off, he could hear them in his head. That was the punishment, I realized, not just death, but possession by the sound of the ocean itself. The rest of the crew grew uneasy when we reported it. Some had heard the voices too, some claimed they hadn't, but everyone understood the danger. Silence became our shield. We spoke less, conserving our words for essential communication only, because every sentence felt like bait for the water to mimic. Nights were the worst, when fatigue set in, and the voices slipped into our dreams, tempting us with conversations that felt too real to ignore. More than once, I woke to find someone muttering, and the rest of us had to shake them awake before they gave too much away. Rule 10 hung over us constantly, shaping how we lived, how we spoke, even how we thought. One evening, while repairing a pressure valve near the observation deck, I felt the urge to test something. I whispered a single nonsense word under my breath, nothing meaningful, just a sound, and pressed my ear against the steel. Moments later, that exact sound whispered back from the water, elongated, distorted, but undeniably mine. My blood ran cold. The ocean didn't just imitate, it recorded, twisted, and returned whatever it was given. That was why Rule 10 demanded absolute silence. Any response, no matter how small, gave the water ammunition, a thread to pull until it unraveled you completely. By the time dawn broke over the endless sea, I knew Rule 10 was the most dangerous of them all. It preyed not on our bodies, but on our memories, our grief, our love. It offered comfort while preparing the abyss. The skeptic had stopped sleeping altogether, afraid his dreams would betray him, while I forced myself into constant vigilance, humming, tapping, anything to remind myself of what was real. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices were growing bolder, closer, more insistent with every passing day. The line between silence and surrender felt razor thin. The last night before everything changed, I sat alone in the observation deck, staring out into the black. My comms were off, but I didn't need them anymore. The voices were in the glass, vibrating faintly, as if the ocean itself was speaking. My sister's voice called me again, calm, patient, promising safety if I would just answer once. I pressed my forehead to the steel, my fists clenched, and forced myself to remain silent. The whisper lingered, waiting, until the shadows moved in the water with deliberate intent. That was when I realized the voices weren't just sound, they were summoning something closer. The moment I descended to the lower observation platform, I felt the full weight of Rule 11, never turn your back on the shadows below, pressing into my chest. The water outside was blacker than any night I had ever seen. Currents still tugging, sirens gone, but leaving a residual hum, and the bioluminescent growths flickered faintly, as if warning me. I knew that at this depth, even the smallest lapse could be fatal. My eyes darted constantly, scanning the abyss beneath, knowing that a single glance away would invite the unseen to envelop me. I tightened my harness, adjusted my flashlight, and took a careful step forward, fully aware that every previous rule had led to this test. The skeptic, breathing shallow and tense beside me, whispered, "I don't like this. It's too quiet." I didn't answer. Silence had become our shield, and speaking even a single word could draw attention. Shadows danced along the edge of my vision, subtle distortions in the water that bent unnaturally, moving in response to currents, voices, and our presence. Every instinct screamed that turning my back, even momentarily, would allow them to surge upward, slipping along the steel beams toward our tethered forms. I reminded myself of the previous lessons: harness, currents, sirens, growths, voices. They were all connected. Obedience wasn't just survival, it was the only way to avoid being swallowed whole. A sudden movement caught my eye beneath the platform, a ripple that should have been impossible in calm water. I froze, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, and realized that this was no longer just a shadow. Something massive, dark and fluid was moving in perfect silence, skimming along the edges of the steel, following every twitch of our tethered bodies. The skeptic muttered under his breath, almost inaudibly, "It's too close. It knows." I could feel the shadows pressing upward, a subtle current in the water that pulled at our limbs, and the glowing patches below seemed to pulse in warning. This was the final test, the culmination of everything the rig had prepared us for. Rule 11 demanded vigilance that bordered on obsession. I slowly edged backward along the platform, never turning my back, forcing my eyes to follow every ripple, every darkened corner. The skeptic mirrored my movements, and for a moment, I could see his wide eyes reflected in my own flashlight beam, both of us aware of how easily the shadows could reach us if we faltered. The water itself seemed alive, reacting to the rhythm of our fear. Currents twisted unpredictably, shadows stretched along the beams, and faint voices whispered again from below. My mind screamed to look away, to retreat, but I forced my gaze downward, toward the abyss, knowing that Rule 11 wasn't just advice, it was a commandment of survival in this living nightmare. Then as we reached the end of the platform, the shadows surged closer, their shapes becoming more defined yet impossible to fully comprehend. One seemed to mirror my movements exactly, a dark echo, sliding through the water like a predator anticipating the perfect moment to strike. I felt the skeptic's hand tighten on mine, and he whispered, "I can't. It's following me too closely." I nodded, understanding exactly how he felt. The shadows weren't random, they were aware, calculating, exploiting any lapse in focus. Obeying Rule 11 meant staying fully present, never looking away, never letting your attention falter, even when exhaustion clawed at your muscles and mind. The bioluminescent growths below flickered violently, as if in panic, casting ghostly patterns across the rig's beams. Currents shifted without warning, tugging at our harnesses, bending our tethers, and forcing us to cling to the steel, as if our lives depended on it, which they did. Voices drifted faintly through the water, calling names, speaking phrases, begging for us to respond, but we did not. Silence was our lifeline, observation our armor. I reminded myself of every previous rule: Rule 6, the currents; Rule 7, the glow; Rule 8, the sirens; Rule 9, the harness; Rule 10, the voices; Rule 11, synthesized all of them, demanding vigilance, discipline, and absolute refusal to turn away. A sudden flicker of movement caught me to the side, and I instinctively spun to face it, keeping the shadows in view at all times. The skeptic whispered sharply, "They're coordinating. They know our pattern." I didn't respond. Any sound could betray us. The shadows twisted in rhythm with the currents, sliding along the platform, pooling in corners, and shifting with uncanny intelligence. I could feel the ocean pressing closer, the abyss, attempting to breach our tethered lives. Each step required deliberate care, each handhold, each glance calculated. Turning away for even a heartbeat could cost us everything. Minutes or perhaps hours passed as we navigated the platform, never turning our backs, every fiber of our being focused on the abyss. My arms ached from holding my flashlight steady, my eyes strained to track each movement in the murky water, and the skeptic was visibly trembling beside me. Shadows rippled, currents twisted, faint whispers teased, and the bioluminescent glow pulsed in warning. I realized then that Rule 11 wasn't just about observation, it was about understanding that the ocean, the rig, and the shadows below were alive in ways no human could fully predict. One misstep, one glance away, and survival became impossible. As we reached the exit ladder, leading to the safer upper decks, a massive shadow surged directly beneath us, cutting across the steel in a wave of darkness that made the water vibrate unnaturally. I could feel the skeptic's body stiffen next to mine, his breath shallow. My own heart pounded in response to the pressure of the abyss, the cumulative weight of every previous rule, and the acute awareness that one of us or both could fail in an instant. I gripped the railing, refusing to blink, refusing to turn, refusing to give the shadow the opportunity it sought. The rig's lights above were just faintly visible, promising safety but not guaranteeing it. Then as I began ascending the ladder, I noticed a subtle movement at the very edge of my vision, something far larger than anything we had encountered before, just beyond the glow of the bioluminescent patches. It didn't advance, but the water itself seemed to lean toward it, the shadows twisting unnaturally, whispering unintelligible words through the depths. I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, that the ocean wasn't done. Rule 11 had been obeyed, yes, but the unseen forces below were patient, and patience in the abyss is far deadlier than haste. I gripped the ladder tighter, staring into the darkness, realizing that the final rule may have only postponed the inevitable. Even now, as I recount the events on the rig, I can feel the shadows pressing at the edges of my perception, the currents tugging faintly, and the voices lingering in my mind. The abyss below is patient, intelligent, and eternal. Never turning your back on the shadows below isn't just a rule, it is a lifelong burden, a vigilance that cannot cease, because the moment you relax, the ocean will remember. I don't know how long I can keep obeying, or if survival is permanent, but every day, every dive, every breath is a reminder. The deep does not forget, and it is always watching. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.